Welcome back, my lovelies. Uh, it is just so great to be here on the podcast with you all today. I am super excited. It is the first week of a new month. And so this episode will be one that is released to all of the platforms in its entirety. And I'd been thinking about this episode all this past month, mainly because this past month was just jam packed with so many opportunities for me to be growing and expanding around my awareness and updating some of the things that I think and teach about narcissism. For those of you that are in Substack or in the community, you know that this month has been a lot of diving back into narcissistic abuse. From the episode we did with Pere at the beginning of November, which, for all the rest of you was released as a full episode. So you got all of that from her diving into her perspectives on it, eventually coming and doing a workshop in the community, which was just also like she rapid fire took everybody's questions. And I found myself just like, yes, nom, nom, nom. This is making so much sense in ways that I really appreciated, and I know they did as well. From that to ultimately, all of that was filled in also with reading my old journals and remembering what it felt like back then for me. I ultimately wrote a Substack article as well, sharing and introducing the continuum that I came up with this last month to better understand what the root causes are behind codependency and narcissism and how they are absolutely related, to all of that culminating in recording the episode that dropped last week with Olivia, a previous one-on-one client of mine, where she shared so deeply and powerfully what it was like. She has just come through her divorce. I believe her divorce took about a year from a very, very narcissistic husband. And that was an incredible, very full circle moment for me as well, because I remember what she was like, where she was at when we first started working together, and the woman that she is now. You got to listen to that episode. Incredible hearing the strength in her voice. So all of that kind of came together to drive home for me once again that narcissism is still in the top 3, if not, I would even go so far as to say the most important topic and educational piece for the majority of the women that I have listening to my podcast. You guys, as my listeners, my women in the community, I was shocked in the community when I dropped the theme this month and everybody was like, oh my God, I'm so excited. I'm so excited. Like, what? Like, I have women that have been in this community for over a year. We talk about this often on coaching calls and, in the chat, but still, they were still so eager to discuss and learn more about it. And that's really why I, knew, especially after all I had learned from this month, I could not walk away from this month without having an episode just kind of updating and sharing the things that were breakthroughs and shifts for me as well. So with that in mind, I'm going to be sharing in this episode 3 main areas that really were kind of just maybe not stuff that I hadn't ever thought of before, but that drove it home in a different way or shifted the focus slightly for me that I want you all to be taking home as well. The first area that I'll be discussing is a podcast episode that a previous client of mine actually shared with me. And this was actually just like a week or so ago. I knew I wanted to listen to this episode before I recorded my own, from an author who wrote a book with, honestly, the title was very frankly triggering for me at the start. The title is They're Not Gaslighting You. Ditch the therapy speak and stop hunting for red flags in every relationship. So just breathe deeply with me. When I first heard that title, I was like, I don't know if I'm going to really jive with this person. But after listening to the episode, and I am going to talk about it quite a bit because I think there's some really important points that she makes and also just things to understand. But I ultimately ended up really like supporting a lot of what she was saying. And I thought she drove home a key piece that really rose to the top this last month for me that came from Paray in her very first episode at the beginning of the month with me, where she said, you know, we need to not be getting hung up around trying to diagnose and identify our partner as a narcissist as much as we need to be focusing on ourself, on how do I feel them and do I want to be with them or not. And this was like the gem, I'd say like the biggest gem that came out of this month for me was just the emphasis moving away from the individual that we're trying to understand, you know, how narcissistic are they or not, and instead bringing the focus back to ourselves. Second area will be discussing in more detail the continuum that I introduced in my Substack article this month, 6 Keys to Unlock Your Understanding of Narcissism. You can find that linked in the show notes. This continuum, y'all, I got to teach it in a workshop in the community this month, and I have found it to be so incredibly helpful, especially for my women who I would say, you know, where their partners fall on that continuum is that they're not with partners who could be clinically diagnosed NPD, and instead, you know, they need to step away from that and come into a more nuanced approach to understanding what's happening that allows them to also be taking responsibility for their own side of the street and not getting so caught up in who's the narcissist, who's the codependent, and more of just understanding both of those are rooted in deep insecurity, lack of self-worth. So I talked about this, provided some beautiful images in the Substack article that will help. If you haven't read that yet, I recommend pausing this, popping over, and just looking at that. It'll make understanding what I'm talking about in depth around the continuum here so much easier. You'll get a lot more out of it. And then finally, the third piece that I wanted to emphasize and kind of end with will be sharing once again, just, you know, even as much as in my first section, I'm going to talk about, you know, this author that says we need to stop using the words narcissism in her view, you know, more flippantly, more, she even goes so far as to say like, we're weaponizing them. We're weaponizing therapy speak. This final piece though, is me really driving home that when it comes to the women that actually are married to partners who would fall in the diagnosable range, which, you know, side note here, y'all, narcissistic individuals very, very rarely get diagnosed. Any books you'll read will tell you about that because they don't have the self-awareness to go in and get diagnosed. So if you are one of those women, though, that would have a partner that technically would be in the diagnosable range, it is so absolutely imperative for you, for these women in this category, to be able to name and call this narcissistic abuse, to name it what it is. And as I'll share, and as you guys got to listen to last week with Olivia, it is an absolute game changer and life-changing on a scale that cannot be underestimated. So that is our overview for what the episode is going to be like. Now let's dive in. So in this first section of our discussion today, as you guys know, in my episode with Paray earlier this month, and even again, she emphasized it in the workshop in the community, she kept bringing us back. Like we're in the workshop and so many of the questions are, how can you spot it? How do you know that your partner's a narcissist? How can you be for sure? Will they change? It was just a lot of focus on the partner. And at the end of that workshop, I loved that Paray really brought it back heavily to like whether they are or not, what you need to be focusing on is how you feel with them. What are the effects on your mental health and wellness? And just kind of cautioning my women in the community against how can we ever really know that we know somebody? You know, it can get really confusing. We can find ourselves going back and forth, and then getting tangled up in like, well, is it me? Is it him? And the projections. And one of the cleanest ways to do that is to come back into your body and ask questions that focus on you. Do I feel better or worse when I spend time with them? Is my mental health improving or declining since being in a marriage with them? Now, this idea was actually supported by the podcast episode that previous client of mine shared. It was a conversation. It was on Dan Harris's 10% Happier podcast. And we'll link this episode in the show notes for my girlies that are potentially, have partners that could be diagnosable. I would be gentle with potentially listening or not listening to this episode. I think it could be really triggering for a lot of you that are in the beginning of trying to trust yourself and trust that there's something off, there's abuse happening here. I found for myself, because I have a pretty deep understanding of narcissism, of the pieces involved in it, that I found it to be very oh, okay, the first, third of it was a little bit rough, I would say, for a lot of you, but the second 2/3, I was like, yes, this is firing. So if you do decide to listen to it, remember, check in with your body, make sure that it's landing for you. And if it's not, if you're starting to feel, thrown off, dysregulated, you can just go, okay, this isn't my truth right now. I don't need to listen to this. So it was this discussion between Dan Harris and the author, Isabel Morley, around her book. I will say the title again here, just so we can all remember what it is. They're Not Gaslighting You. Ditch the therapy speak and stop hunting for red flags in every relationship. And on her website, it said the premise of this book is that the DSM was never meant to be a self-help book, but we often turn our partners into case studies. They're Not Gaslighting You reminds us of the importance of protecting the true meaning of clinical terms and shows us that empathy and vulnerability will improve our relationships more than pathologizing our partners ever could. Okay. So we're going to tread softly through this, but I think this is a conversation that's very important to have, because obviously straight out the gate, I felt protective, especially when pretty early into the episode, she does emphasize how she says, she thinks people are weaponizing therapy speak. And even in this statement here where she says, empathy and vulnerability will improve our relationships more than pathologizing our partners ever could, I have to emphasize once again that what I have found, especially with partners that are further along the continuum into diagnosable narcissistic personality disorder than not, empathy and vulnerability actually can be the very things that get used against you in a dynamic like this. And I will talk about this later on, that I think the reason why her perspective is so strongly this is because as much as I tried to research around her, I could not find anything that says she's actually experienced narcissistic abuse or exited a narcissistic marriage. And I have seen over and over how those that have not actually been a recipient of narcissistic abuse often come to that dialogue with just a level of lacking lived experience of how deeply confusing, twisted, and convoluted it can feel. So just hold all of that gently as we go through talking about this a little bit more. So instead, her arguments in the book, They're Not Gaslighting You, appear to be rooted more in her professional observations and her clinical work as a therapist. And I do resonate with this piece, a desire for her to combat overdiagnosis in relationships and social media discourse, which I can agree with. When she got into the weeds of how, only 6% of the clinical population can actually be diagnosed with narcissistic personality disorder, yes, I agree. I totally see that. That's what I've seen in my work as well. I'd actually say with the women that I work with, I was thinking back over okay, out of all the women I've worked with, how many have I worked with that actually have partners that could probably be fully diagnosed? I would offer I have a higher percentage than that. I would say, looking back over, it's probably more like 15 to 20% of the women that I see. And I think that's because I speak to women who are experiencing these kinds of things. I can't tell you how many women I've had reach out to me about the podcast that are like, holy shit, you are saying, describing, explaining something that I have wondered about, been confused about for years and years and years, and never understood until listening to your podcast and feeling like, okay, this is somebody that gets me. But with her bringing up the overdiagnosis piece, I want to present in this episode, I think where she comes from a little bit more of like, it needs to be, one or the other. We need to only use the term narcissist for people that could truly be diagnosed fully as NPD, or not use it at all for other people. I find it is an and. Yes, an NPD, individual narcissistic personality disorder, needs to only be used in relation to people that could truly be diagnosed with that. And as I'll explain in the continuum later, we still need, though, to be thinking about these terms and understanding where they fall on that continuum of codependency and narcissism. So with that in mind, I did find, listening to the episode, that we agreed on some really key things, though, that once we got into that part, I was like, yes, this is important. And seeing it mirrored, because of course what she was talking about was the same stuff Pere was, I realized how much I loved that these two voices, Pere and then also Isabel Morley, were emphasizing once again that we need to remove our focus from pathologizing our partner and instead realizing, and this is what she said, quote, you can stay and survive this or leave. You can't control the other person. The ultimate boundary is leaving. If you decide to stay, then you have to consciously know that you will have to pick your battles. And that was just a smattering of like some of the quotes that I pulled from her podcast episode. So these pieces I love. I love when she brought it solidly back. Like, she took the power out of, let me figure out who they are, how can I define them, and back into really deciding for yourself. And she emphasized that we need to see that person's level of awareness of how they are and interact with the world around them. Okay, so we're just really more evaluating, like, what's their level of awareness? You don't even have to call them a narcissist to do that. And then realizing if that ends up being low, accepting that they are just going to be a hard person to be in a relationship with. And this is where I started getting like, yes, I love this. I loved just a little bit more of like the clean, okay, this is just who this person is. And instead of continuing to distract myself, which I feel like we can kind of get into of, well, are they a narcissist in this ways? Do they fit all of the characteristics? Are they actually or not? We come back to what's their level of awareness, self-awareness. If it's low, this just means they're going to be a hard person to be in a relationship with. Mic drop, y'all. And it reminded me too of Lindsay Gibson's books, right? Adult Children of Emotionally Immature Parents, or How to Disentangle Yourself from Emotionally Immature People. I realized so I pulled that book back out this month and I looked at the back in her Disentangling from Emotionally Immature People book. She has a list of like, here are the characteristics of emotionally immature people. And I realized, I was like, oh, these are the characteristics of what we would, quote, label a narcissist. And so if we have to split hairs here, and Isabel Morley saying, let's stop calling everybody a narcissist because that's an actual therapeutic, like, clinical term and we're overusing it. Well, great news is you don't have to call somebody a narcissist. You can just understand they're emotionally immature. And I think that might help a lot of you that are getting hung up on reading all the stuff about narcissists, looking at all the different things and still going, are they a narcissist or not? Instead of just accepting and going, how emotionally immature are they? Because why that's important is once you can kind of, okay, this is the level they're at, then you can start moving back into where your power really lies, which is what am I going to choose based off of that? Like I said, the gem that came out of this month, because Pare had said the same thing, right? Someone had asked her in the workshop if relationships with narcissistic individuals can get better. And she said point blank, she was like, yeah, they can. But, depending on someone's level of that narcissistic continuum behavior, it's going to take you deciding what you can live with and focusing on that. The book that really started me off on this journey that I have loved and recommended lots of my women to, The Wizard of Oz and Other Narcissists. I remember the moment when I was learning about narcissism, and I was being kind of like, as I was reading, hopeful. I think that question, can a narcissist change? Can it get better? That's something I see lots of women, myself included, asking. And I got to the end of that book, and she just, once again, really point blank said, look, you have to decide what you're okay living with, staying and hoping he's going to magically change and one day wake up with empathy and emotional maturity and insights into like me and who I am, just is not the reality. And instead, it's coming into a more, I think of it as kind of like we're stepping out of that healing fantasy that Lindsay Gibson talks about in her books into reality and going, okay, this is what it is. This is who this person is that I married. Now, what am I going to do about it? What is the life that I want to have? What are the benefits, detriments? What's the 50-50 here? I talk about this on the podcast often, right? It's going to be hard both ways. It's just picking which hard do I want most. And I liked this a lot because I felt like it started kind of removing so much of the emotion that can become a huge part of trying to like figure out if your partner's a narcissist or not. One of the other things I really loved that Isabel Morley emphasized was that it is a matter of degree. And she said, if this is the way they are, your options are to see if you can have a relationship with them, change it, or leave it. Like, it was just I don't know. I think maybe because Pare and Isabel like deal with this all the time, perhaps, or they're in I think specifically I know Pare has done like couples, and I know that Isabel Morley, she is specifically a couples therapist. There's just this kind of like clear cut, it just is what it is, and you have to ultimately take responsibility for yourself on accepting like, okay, once you start seeing who they are and you start seeing, what level can they change? How much of it is really genuine or not? So where's that level of awareness and self, desire for self-growth? Are you okay with staying in the relationship with them or leaving it? And I think this is why I'm just like so obsessed about this part, y'all. I think this is why so many of us spend so many years in the trying to diagnose our partner piece, because it's kind of scary to sit back and take responsibility for that decision when maybe you don't fully know what you want most. And this is why I think, and I've seen this in my one-on-one clients, I see it in the community, why there is a process, an important process while you're going through and considering divorce, of coming to really know yourself. Not only to be looking at the negatives, this makes me think of my 90 minutes where we focus. Yes, there's a big portion where I'm like, tell me about the before. Tell me about everything that led up to this moment, being on this call with me because you're considering divorce. But super and almost just as much, like I would say equal to and just as important, is looking to the future and knowing yourself about what do I want most out of my life? What can I not live without? If I think back to those journals I was reading, like early on when I first started therapy, I didn't even know at the time what I wanted because I hadn't lived a life where I'd really been asked, like, what do you want? What matters to you? What are you passionate about? I'd lived my life for other people, through other people, for other people, through the, codependent lens. And it's it becomes a process of starting to branch out, to find those things, to ask yourself, to tie back into the parts of yourself when you were really young. What did she want? Made me think of, Olivia, when we were talking about her episode, she told me how much when she and her husband were dating, she wanted, it was like one of her deepest passions to be able to adopt. And he had seemed on board with it. And then once they got married, he was absolutely 100% against it. And that was a dream that she gave up that I'm now watching her, bring back in to her life, call back in, acknowledge again. And this is the part of the journey that you can't, I guess you can skip this part and, maybe get really focused on like, oh, it's my partner. And once I get divorced, it's going to be so much better because he's not going to be here. But then you get divorced and you realize, oh, I still don't know myself. I still don't know what I want. And it's not just like magically there now because this person isn't in my life. So this is a really, really important piece to remember. And I think this is why I'm so obsessed with my work with women in the process of considering, because there's so much room here to be discovering this part, to be branching out, to be connecting in. I think of the community, like the community is a gorgeous space for this, where you get to start seeing women figuring out these pieces about themselves and doing the work to figure it out yourself. And I loved this zinger that Isabel Morley said kind of towards the end of the episode, where she said, quote, "You want the diagnosis so you know what to do." And I was like, oh, exactly. Like it makes me think so much of, when women come to me and they're like, I wish he would just hit me, or I wish he would have an affair so that then I would have an excuse. It's like we're waiting to be able to like put the stamp on them and say, he's a narcissist, so now I get to leave. And it's understanding, my loves. Yes, you can do that and you can get out with that. In fact, and I would offer, it is an important, like for some of us, we can't get out without that. For me, that was the case. I needed to be able to see those narcissistic behaviors, call my husband narcissistic when I was getting divorced, to help fuel and get me out. And I'm so grateful I did. So it's also understanding like, yes, you may need that. And also, long term, it's not about whether your partner was a narcissist or not. It really has to come back to, what do you want for your life? So even if, as I would say now, like I'm 6 years out of my divorce, and I wouldn't necessarily like call my ex-husband, and in the words of Isabel Morley, I don't think my ex-husband would at all be able to be fully clinically diagnosed as a narcissistic personality disordered individual. And so even now, it's really not that helpful anymore to think of him that way, as much as it is more to come into the realm of like knowing just his level of emotional maturity, and how much he was, aware of his own actions, behaviors, feelings, deeper trauma, right? And that's so key for those of us that are in that category, which I would say is about 80% of the women that listen to the podcast or work with me in the community. We fall more in this range because we're the ones that have to go forward and co-parent with partners where you're actually going to be co-parenting, not parallel parenting. If you have a partner, which I know some of you do, that would be full-blown diagnosable, you're going to be parallel parenting. That was another gem that Paray really drove home for us in the workshop of like, you need to hardcore parallel parent. But for the rest of us that are going to be in more of a co-parenting dynamic, it is much more helpful to not pathologize your ex-husband and to understand them from more of that like compassionate emotional immaturity. They've got trauma. They're responding from their coping mechanisms. I get to be the adult. I get to set the boundaries. Now, one of the other things that I noticed and found fascinating in this conversation between Dan Harris and Isabel Morley was that I think why she might be on the end of kind of this like anti-diagnosing and fighting back against using those words is because I think perhaps when she's working with narcissistic individuals in her practice, what I think she's running up against more is the individual who would be considered the NPD individual is the one who's actually diagnosing their partner as the narcissist. So there was this big, I wouldn't say it was big, but it was definitely a trigger in the episode where she ends up sharing a story of how, when she's meeting a new couple, if one of them reaches out to her ahead of time before they've gotten a chance to meet as a couple and tells her, like, hey, I just need you to know my partner is actually narcissistic. She said that means she knows that that person is the narcissist. And I was like, WTF? Like, no, 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 no. And that's because I remember after doing about two years of therapy, of individual therapy, my now husband at the time wanted to do couples. And I remember wanting so badly to call that couples therapist and be like, heads the fuck up. This is what I've been learning and this is what I've been feeling and experiencing. And I do not want to go into this and be walked around in a circle. And, I'm going to throw this word out here, like gaslit in this dynamic with the two of you. And I see this happen a lot for my women that are in couples counseling of, one of the things you struggle with the most if you are experiencing narcissistic abuse is doubting your own reality, doubting your feelings, doubting being able to trust yourself. So I wanted to point this out, especially for those of you that end up listening to this episode of hers, because I was like, no, 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 no. Like, that is not an indicator to me that someone is a narcissist. If I was a couples therapist and somebody were to call me ahead of time and say, I'm worried that my partner's actually a narcissist, I would not be like, oh, that's the narcissist, the person who's saying that. But I have seen this happen on the flip side of partners who, in fact, I have a one-on-one client right now who has been going to couples therapy. When we started working together, we were still like, the beginning of her starting to really notice these traits and behaviors of her partner. And as she started to pull back more and more in the dynamic, Pere calls it, you're removing the supply. So individuals that are more narcissistic, they interact with people more as supply than they do in true empathic ways. So as she's getting better boundaries, as she's pulling back and resourcing herself more in herself, he's losing the supply. And sure enough, y'all, after we'd worked together for it's been about 3 months now, her husband shows up to their couples therapy and out of kind of the blue says, turns out I've realized she is the narcissist and I need to let all of my family know how badly she has treated me. Just like a total flip on the story. And now all of a sudden, she is responsible. She is the bad guy, when all along he'd still been struggling to even like take responsibility for his part. But now he's firmly moved into like, I am the victim. She's the narcissist. I think that's probably a little bit more of what Isabel Morley might be seeing. She also shared this really interesting piece of like, I guess partners on dating apps, like listing, like, make sure you don't have, was it bipolar disorder? I think that's what it was for women. And so I think it's important, especially for so many of you on this podcast that are also like, if you do end up getting divorced, you're going to go back out into the dating pool. And I see this in my women in the community right now, the ones who are, have gotten divorced and are now dating, which is so fun because we're all getting to like hear from them and hear how it's going. But this can be something to keep an eye out as well on, meeting individuals who are already wanting to pathologize you straight out the gate, and understanding that can be a technique that actually, crazy enough, narcissistic individuals do, of calling somebody else the narcissist. And if you're going, oh my God, this is so confusing, my brain is spun all around, who's the narcissist, who's not? Remember, we have to keep coming back to the key gem of this episode, which is it's not about knowing who is or who isn't, which when I talk in a little bit about the continuum, you'll get that. We all have narcissistic and codependent behaviors. It's more, how do I feel with them and what's the level of emotional maturity of this individual? Can they see how they're behaving? Can they take responsibility for their behaviors? So most of all, if you do listen to that episode, I want you to just, like I said earlier, tread gently with yourself. You need to remember where her and the host Dan Harris are ultimately coming from, which is, as far as I could tell in research, they are not from backgrounds where they experienced narcissistic abuse. And I find people like this can often say things that emphasize how we have, outsized expectations for relationships, or we think bad behavior is abusive when it's really just bad. That's all well and good for individuals that are, coming from their previous situations. That can be really difficult for those of us that are in the thick of actually experiencing partners with narcissistic traits and behaviors. And that would be the majority of the women listening to this podcast, right? Because often y'all have actually done the opposite. You have spent years minimizing what's happening. Like, you have spent years calling what's actually abuse bad behavior instead, where they're saying, don't call bad behavior abuse. Often you guys are in the opposite camp where you've been calling what's abusive bad behavior. There is absolutely appropriate areas to name gaslighting when that's exactly what it fucking is. So if you are one of my girlies that struggles hearing other people's thoughts and then losing track of your own truth, you can maybe pass on this episode that I'm going to be linking in the show notes. But there were just a lot of good gems here that I wanted to share here that ultimately I felt like reinforced what I was hearing from Pere, which was, we need to come back into responsibility for ourselves, not getting so caught up in the kind of labyrinth, endless looping of, is my partner narcissistic? Are they not? And she also had, in various sections, some other very helpful, like she had a list of like 10 characteristics that narcissistic individuals have. I ultimately thought, like, this is some really good information. And most of all, I loved that she emphasized that, she said, quote, if someone does have these traits, it will be hard. You have to decide, how much do I want to invest in this relationship? And then she finished with this zinger that I just was like, oh, this is the heart. She said, quote, some people are doing their best and it's not enough for you. We can all support each other in that process instead of pathologizing each other. And this part I love for my group of the 80% of you that are in the piece of, your partner could not be fully clinically diagnosed, but has these traits and behaviors. And we don't need to be pathologizing them or calling them these names to ultimately decide for ourselves that their best is just not enough for you. Ooh, and I know that's so uncomfortable for those of us that are in that codependent range, right? When we have to finally just go, it's not because you're a bad person. It's not because any of those other things. It's just, I don't want this. Yes, it is one of the hardest things to do. And I also think it's one of the most empowering, because it brings you squarely back into you doing it for you. Makes me think too, I have clients who, they'll want divorce at one point because their partner is behaving in ways that they can't handle. And then their partner will start cleaning those things up. And then they come to me and they're like, man, I should have left then because I had an excuse. Now he's being better and I don't have an excuse. And I have to remind them, you don't need an excuse. You get to decide for yourself, as she said, if someone's best is still just not enough for you. Oof. And I'm going to finish this section, leaving it like right there, because I know as women, it is so hard for us to be able to say, like, that's your best and it's still not enough for me. And that's okay, because that's taking radical responsibility for your one life. Now, this is going to segue beautifully into this next part where I want to dive in and really flesh out in ways that I can't in writing, that I can more easily in the podcast, why the continuum that I introduced in my Substack article and did a gorgeous workshop in the community is like so on point and ties in really beautifully to all of this. You know, here we've got Isabel Morley saying, hey, let's stop calling people narcissists when only 6% of the clinical population could actually be diagnosed them. Okay, well, how do we make sense of then all the rest of the people that exhibit those traits and behaviors? This is where the continuum comes in. So, one of the like aha moments for me as I was earlier this month, I'd been reading journals, I'd been prepping for us talking about narcissism in the community. I knew I wanted to talk about it in a different way, was getting out this visual. I was talking with Joe one day. I was like, let me pour out all these thoughts, all these things I know about narcissism and codependency. And I feel like feel like there are two sides of the same coin. Like, how do they go together? Help me figure this out. And where we landed was, as you'll see in the images over on that Substack article, that ultimately codependency and narcissism are both rooted in a lack of self-esteem. So I notice them pop up, these ways of interacting when an individual is feeling deep down, like I am not enough. And when it comes to codependency, they get that feeling, they get rid of the feeling of I am not enough through abandonment of self for others. So, at the root of it is this fear, I am not enough. And they seek control to get that feeling away, to get the feeling of being back in control through empathy. And codependency taken far enough, right? When you get out further on that end is where we start getting the self-abandonment. Now, on the flip side, the narcissist does this through prioritization of self at the expense of others. So where codependency is an abandonment of self for others, narcissism is a prioritization of self at the expense of others. And you can see that when that gets triggered, right? I am not enough, the feeling of a lack of self-esteem, they feel that fear and they want control and they move into it through self-importance. And this is where you'll see narcissistic individuals manipulating others, trying to get that feeling of importance or self-worth through other people outside of them doing things for them, respecting them, loving them. I mean, God, have I not seen this massively? We actually did a conversation in the community this month around sexual coercion with the women in the community. And just over and over, I saw how much sexual coercion at its root is, partners not feeling like they are enough and then seeking that feeling of enoughness through getting sex from their spouse. And, on the flip side, as well as the codependent, abandoning yourself and what you want to give that to the other person. It's like you can sense they need this. And so you abandon yourself to give it to them. Ultimately, though, we end up in this dance, right? Where everybody's trying to find self-worth through people outside of them, either narcissistically through wanting to control or change them, or codependently through abandoning yourself. If there's less of me and I make more people feel full, maybe somehow I will be enough. It's so counterintuitive, but it's what we learn as children. And the answer being to come to the middle of this continuum. So what I realized in noticing both of these is I was like, okay, we need both of these aspects. Like, we need empathy, which is the root of how codependents work, and we need self-importance as well, which is kind of the way narcissists use their control. But we want to have those balanced in the center, which is where I believe secure attachment comes in, which is where we have this balance of empathy and self-importance. Versus when we don't have secure attachment, we are more likely to be pulled either way. And what you'll see is, typically we have a starting gate route that we take. When I was married, that was codependency for me. That was really what I was trained into. I had a mother whose route of behavior was narcissism. And I would offer, looking back at my mother's behavior and her lack of being able to have like true self-awareness and really change, I would offer, I truly believe my mother could have been clinically diagnosed, the level she was at. So in being in a relationship with someone who could have been, in my opinion, clinically diagnosed, on the flip side of that, right? That's the level of codependency I grew up with, just raised in. It was who I knew myself to be. I didn't really have an identity because I was just the foil for my mother's narcissism. As I watched myself start healing, though, up into the secure attachment, it's been so fascinating. And this is why I'm obsessed with this continuum, to watch myself vacillate now back and forth between these two. I've been able to recognize that I can also, flip into more of a narcissistic way of wanting to get things done now. It's not all just codependent like it was previously. And as I'm learning more and more about disorganized attachment styles, there is anxious attachment, there is avoidant attachment, and then there's a more rare form, which is called disorganized attachment. I'm beginning to also formulate and see how disorganized attachment individuals, we can kind of do both. We can flip back and forth. That's something I am excited to talk about in the future as I'm learning more and more about, as someone who has disorganized attachment, like how do you heal into secure attachment? How do you, how do you find that self-love? How do you build that self-worth? I think that's probably been the root underneath all of my work, under all of my journey, has been secure attachment with myself. I think also that's what draws so many of you to the podcast and to the work that I do and to the community, because yes, it's through the lens of considering divorce, but at the heart of it is secure attachment work, coming into and developing secure attachment with yourself. Now, why this continuum was, in my opinion, like it felt groundbreaking for me and for women in my community, was because I knew I had been watching the women in my community and I'd been seeing how the ones that are more in this like 80% group were getting hung up on this idea of like, wait, but he can't be the narcissist because sometimes I show up with narcissistic traits. Sometimes I'm the one with the narcissistic behavior. And I also had like, in the back of my head, as I've been reflecting back on my own marriage and thinking about the ways I had behaved, I'd even had, my ex-husband, it's been 6 years now, in some of those years post-divorce, him even saying like, well, you also behaved in these ways. And so as I've been able to do more of my work and come into my own like self-responsibility for my side of the street, I've been able to see how, looking back on my marriage now, it really was both. Like, I think both me and my ex-husband had disorganized attachment styles, potentially. I know I do. I don't know about him, but I knew that we could do both. There were times where he showed up codependent and I was showing up more narcissistically. And that just means I was in a space of self-prioritization at the cost of him. And he was in the space of self-abandonment of himself to give me what I needed, right? And this is why this became such a beautiful, like, I feel like breakthrough moment for me, and hopefully for the women in the community too, because I started to see and neutralize a little bit more the word narcissist and codependent. And I started to see just how much I am both at times. And that was helping me massively this month in my work, in my relationship with myself, because I could catch myself more easily. I could catch when I was starting to feel that like kind of feeling, and noticing when my brain was like, my partner, Joe needs to fix this. Joe needs to do this differently. Joe needs to desire me more. Joe needs to come, do this differently. And because I was paying attention from this month to like, oh, there's a continuum and I can go to both sides, I was noticing, oh, wait a second. There's my self-worth, obviously, getting impacted somehow. I'm feeling like I'm not enough. And I'm just wanting to go to an external source. I'm wanting Joe to change who he is so that I can feel a different way about me. And it was like, oh, ding, 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 ding. I am using a narcissistic coping mechanism right now to handle these feelings of a lack of self-worth. Or, on the flip side, when I am, wanting to self-abandon to make somebody else feel better. I had an incident this month where I had to really clearly communicate with someone that I'd worked with, about the ending of our professional connection, and that I wasn't happy with some of the ways they had behaved. And oh, did I feel the pull towards the codependency, especially when that person kind of reached back out and was like, well, I hope we can, resolve this in the future. And I knew for myself, I had no desire to have any kind of professional connection with this person. Based off of what had happened, it just was not a fit for me. And oh, did I feel the desire to self-abandon, to just write back, yeah, sure, maybe someday in the future it'll work out for us, to just make that person feel better. And instead, I breathed deep and I was like, no, I will not self-abandon to make this individual feel better. I'm going to continue to stay in my truth. I'm going to be honest about what I actually feel and need, and that it's not going to be a fit for me moving forward. And y'all, it felt like death in its own tiny way in the short term. But God, right after I sent that message, I felt so much relief, because I knew in the long term, that's me keeping those relationships clean. That's me stepping away from playing the codependent to someone's narcissistic behavior just to try and keep things smooth, and instead staying in secure attachment in my own self-worth, which is me being able to say, no, this still just isn't a fit for me. I understand you want something different, still not a fit for me. And why that's so beautiful and groundbreaking when you think about it in the continuum way is because this becomes a massive, beautiful tool for self growth. Especially, I want you to use it intentionally, obviously, because for some of you, like I said, you may need to really just hold those titles, acknowledge your codependency, see the more narcissistic behavior in your partner, and be able to just, okay, I'm the codependent, he's the narcissist. I know I used that to get through the process of my divorce to help me, especially because I was so codependent, to really lean in. But post that, or for those of you where doing that is not helping, this is so great because it can get you out of that cycle of having to make them the narcissist/villain, and you in response being the codependent/victim space, which we did a couple months ago. We talked about this in the community, the drama triangle, how we move from, the villain to the savior to the victim, and really stepping off of that. And that's where I think sometimes the words narcissist, even the word codependent, can start to be used in this way where you're really, as she said, pathologizing, dehumanizing the person across from you. And I do think that's necessary in some ways on these lower levels of awareness. But with this tool, and hopefully for many of you that have been listening to the podcast for a while, you have enough awareness now that I think it's a kind of beautiful jump, like a, stepping up into a little bit more of the emotional adulthood piece, taking responsibility for yourself and not needing to name or call somebody something, to give yourself permission to just do what you want to do. Mind blowing, right, y'all? And this ties into something I've been feeling like a deeper undercurrent for a while in my work, especially this summer when we talked about nonviolent communication. Just that when we label and we judge other people, it is a form of violence. And I think that's really part of what Isabel Morley is trying to call us to, right? Of we don't have to do this verbal violence against each other. And when we do, we unknowingly put those people in a villain role and we put ourselves in a victim, which if you're someone like me with disorganized attachment, then when you end up acting narcissistically, oh shit, well now who's the villain? I must be the villain. And it prevents that self-growth and that introspection that when we can kind of pull back from all of those things, if you're at a point where you can do that, you can just start understanding it more from realms of like, yeah, these are the coping mechanisms we have. What are the levels that they're at in our relationship? How much is my partner, aware and open to healing and growing and changing? And if not, I get to decide for myself what is the path I want to take going forward. And why I love you adopting this mindset, even ahead of time, right? Is because absolutely post divorce, I'm saying this can be helpful when you're trying to make the decision and you're trying to get through a divorce, especially if you've been in a very codependent space where you like self-abandon for the other person. But post divorce, y'all, it is so disempowering to continue thinking of yourself in a framework of like, ooh, evil, bad narcissist, me, the victim, codependent, because victimhood robs us of our ability to be the creators of our lives, to coach ourselves no matter what we've been through, to like look at the past and be like, yes, I know that happened to me, but ultimately I am the creator, and to challenge ourselves to do something differently. As you guys know from your work with me, your thoughts create your reality. So just remembering, as much as it's more of like a temporary thing, I think, using these terms, right? Use them if needed, but if possible, being able to step back and just understand I don't have to think of myself as a victim and them as the villain to be able to make choices that are good for me. Also, tying back into what I was saying, with me and Joe and seeing my own narcissistic behavior right now, you know, this continuum has given me the ability to have the awareness. Awareness is like, in coaching, I often feel like awareness is like 75% of the process. Like once you start having awareness and you can catch the patterns and you can see what you're doing, then we can really start changing things. And so in catching, oh, I'm behaving a little bit more narcissistically here. Wait a second. Why am I doing that? And then following it back to the root of, oh, I'm feeling like I'm not enough right now. That then opens the door. Okay. Now, instead of being spiraled out into like coming after Joe and being like, not even coming after Joe, because I never come after Joe, but in a like flooded, kind of dysregulated, I don't feel like I'm enough state, coming to Joe and being like, I need this and I need this. And why aren't you doing this? Right. I'm able to pause. I'm able to ground, to catch myself. And then in that moment, start doing the work that I really ultimately teach, like my one-on-one clients, we teach this in depth, which is how to meet yourself in that pain of the lack of self-worth, in that feeling of not enoughness, how to, instead of abandoning yourself in that moment, to stay, right? It's not abandoning yourself or going and getting somebody else to fix it. It's being with yourself. And then through things like parts work, as I've mentioned previously on the podcast, through CPTSD work, through grief work, you start being there for yourself, resourcing yourself. And this is the deeper work that is available when you can let the shame of the labeling kind of fall and just see them for the coping mechanisms that they are, or as Isabel Morley said, the protective responses that many of us have developed. And I love this because ultimately I want to live in a world, and I think this is a huge key for the world that I hope we're building in the future, a world where we don't have to label and see people as bad or evil for ourselves to be able to clean up our own self-connection. Yes, we can see their behavior. We can see the behavior for what it is, but we don't have to actually label the person or see them as bad or evil. Now, I want to finalize this piece by telling you to please remember that if you are seeing those kinds of traits and behaviors in your partner, But they, on the flip side, okay, are lacking the awareness to see the effects of their actions, or as Morley said, to quote, have insight into their shame, or to take genuine personal responsibility for their part. Okay, Pere would say, this is where sometimes they'll change, but they're not really genuinely changing. They're just pretending to try and keep their supply. Remember to come back to understanding that some people are doing their best and it's just not enough for you. So this is the other piece that I want to caution against. This is why I'm like, final piece that I want you to remember is you got to come back to, you may be on board with this. You may be on board with, letting go of the labels and doing the deeper work and having self-awareness and meeting yourself and resourcing yourself and developing secure attachment with yourself. That does not mean your partner is on the same page. And if they are not, like, that is what you're doing in the process of considering divorce. You're evaluating how high or low is my partner's emotional awareness, their emotional maturity, their ability to be present with me and themselves, the ability to know what's going on for them, their awareness of their internal world. And even if they are doing their very best and it is not enough for me, that is okay. Like, period. That gets to be it, loves. If it is not enough for you, that gets to be it. Please remember and take that away from this episode most of all, because so many of us don't, we don't respect or value the incredible importance of our life, us living a genuine life, us living a life where we are honest, connected, like all the things we dream of and want. And we are often so willing to let that go just because the phrases that are coming up are like, because he's a quote, good guy. Yeah, my ex-husband was a good guy and it still wasn't enough for me. And for me, that was hands down the best choice I ever made, because the life that I live now is way more of enough for me. And I'm having this moment of realizing, it's just kind of the thought that's coming to me is I'm bougie. I'm high maintenance. I want a really, really fabulous, deeply involved, present kind of life. And it's taken me years to be able to say that confidently now. But damn, do I have never, let me put it this way, I've never regretted making the decision. I look back now, I had to call him a narcissist to feel okay about that, because back then I didn't have enough self-worth or self-love to say it's just not enough for me and that's it. But looking back, that's really what it was. It just wasn't enough for me. And it's so incredible that I was able to do that, y'all, because I look back, I really had no framework for what would be enough for me. I was just like, I'm going to trust myself. My soul calls are calling me this way and I'm going to follow it. And I know, because I had done a lot of work and I'd learned a lot, I knew a lot about where my partner was at in his emotional maturity level and his ability to have self-awareness. And although I couldn't say it at that time, it just wasn't enough for me. And 6 years later, I love that is the foundation I have built this life off of, because it's allowing me to build a life that is truly enough for me, because my assets, my resources, my gifts, my talents, my energy all get poured into the things that I really feel like are enough for me. Goes back to that, that individual this month that I was like, hey, it's not a fit. I don't put my energy and my assets into things that ultimately are not a fit for me anymore. And what that does is allow you to create a life that's very, very deeply aligned with you and what you want most. Now, all of this culminates, this whole episode, in this final third section that I want to talk about, which is that for women that truly are in marriages with individuals that would most likely be diagnosed NPD, okay, for me, it's about 20% Okay. As I was looking back over like all my one-on-one clients, women I've met on 90 minutes, I was like, it's a higher percentage for me. The amount of women that have enough indicators where I'm like, oh, it's about 15 to 20% of the women listening and that I've worked with. For that 20%, y'all are in a different category, okay? And learning about and identifying narcissistic behaviors is everything. It is literally the game changer for your life. And emphasizing this in this episode really came out of a couple things that happened this last month. One was that episode with Olivia. Y'all, we've stayed in a little bit of touch, but I hadn't gotten to hear like the details really of this last year for her journey, going through the divorce. And it was just, mind blown for me. I knew when I first started working with her, I was like, this woman is beautiful and deep and brilliant, but she was so deeply under-resourced. And she had a lot of effects just from the narcissistic abuse for so many years. Those effects, depression, self-doubt, anxiety, spinning, hypervigilance, all of those pieces. So to see her a year later was like, oh, wow, this is huge. And that came directly from our work together on the 90-minute. We did a 90-minute, and then she ultimately decided to work with me one-on-one. But it came out of me identifying on that first call, like, whoa, there are definitely some serious traits and behaviors here. And having that validation, I think it is so crucial, so incredibly crucial for the group of you in the 20%. Like I said, it is life-changing. I think it's also crucial for those of you in the 80%, right? And I'm talking about those of you that are specifically coming to me with like, hey, there's some kind of narcissistic traits and behaviors here. It's super important for y'all too, but for those of you married to truly diagnosable NPD individuals, this is the key. Until you know and can name it and can spot it, it is almost impossible to get out. This was also like driven home for me because I had another one of my previous one-on-one clients. She also falls into the category. Both Olivia and her, I remember when I first met them on the calls, the abuse that they were describing, I was like, whoa, this is some of the worst psychological narcissistic abuse I have ever seen. And I could see it in them, just the massive lack of like loss of self, prioritization of their partner, inability to like choose for themselves, or just all the signs were there. And when we first started coaching together, we actually only made it through, like 8 sessions of her entire coaching container before we just kind of had to take a break. And that can sometimes happen when you're dealing with something as deep as a marriage to a potentially NPD individual. It can take time. It can take time to wake up, to start seeing these patterns, to start getting resourced. She had nobody else in her life who knew about what was going on. And this is the other really tricky thing with NPD, true NPD individuals, is often on the outside. Everybody else sees them as this wonderful person, just taking me back to when my mother got diagnosed with cancer. And everybody loved my mother in her community, just thought she was the most wonderful person. And yet only those closest to her knew what it was really like. And that's very like isolating and disorienting because nobody else knows the abuse that you've actually been experiencing within the dynamic. And that was the case with this client of mine. I was really the first person that she'd ever been like, this is what's happening to me. And so blown away though, that even with just those, so in my 3 months of coaching, in my one-on-one containers with my women, that's a total of 13 sessions that we do together. So we've done a total of 8 sessions. And even with just those 8 sessions, she had enough tools that she started shifting and doing things. And then it just took time. She just needed some space to let that work start sinking in. And also a lot of it is, I will just like say this straight up, it's scary. It's scary for a lot of those of you with a true NPD partner, because those partners, will escalate. They often, as you start pulling back the supply, they start increasing the abuse. And so it's just a process that takes a certain amount of time of you steadily setting boundaries, pulling back, taking better care of yourself, building a resource and a foundation in yourself to be ready and strong enough to eventually leave. It's the same process I had to do with Pare. Like, looking back, that's exactly what I had to do. Um, and I think it was almost, even though I wouldn't characterize my ex-husband as a true NPD individual, I think it was exacerbated because I had come from a family with a mother who was. So I was already like massively codependent in ways that I think, I think there were a lot of ways where I, without him even needing me to abandoned ahead of time, if that's making sense in our relationship. And so Bray, it took her, 2 years to really walk me back to myself, back into my body, seeing myself. So it was so freaking just like, awesome to have this client reach back out to me and be like, hey, we've gotten attorneys. We're going through the divorce. I'd really love to meet with you for, my last few sessions, and to get on with her. We just did 2 sessions. On the second one, I was like losing my mind. She looked like she was speaking, acting like a different person, like so much more. And by a different person, I mean like confident, able to spot what's happening. I'd seen how her having an attorney, her husband had done some things that are definitely illegal, and having an attorney there to support her, who has her back, who's, now bringing external authority to play. Often you'll see true NPD individuals do not respond to anything besides external authority. And so as long as they can keep it between you and them, they will. But once external authority gets involved, that's when you see it start to shift and be cleaned up. Which, external authority is attorneys, the courts, police, right? That's what I'm talking about. And to see her on that call, just so confidently being like, I see it now, and calling it out and speaking up and setting boundaries for herself and saying no more, I was like, wow, this is a woman who over the last year, multiple moments I've thought of her and thought, I hope she's doing well. I hope things are moving forward. I understand how long of a process it can take. Just considering divorce in general, but then when you add on the extra element of dealing with true narcissistic personality disorder in your partner, um, it's a process. Sometimes I describe it as like you're just clawing yourself back out psychologically from the whole of what the abuse and the, codependency has done to your personality, to your self-worth, all of those pieces. And it was just amazing to see her, this woman who, when I'd coached her previously, she'd been very like hyper vigilant, always accommodating him, really trying to change her behavior to not affect him, trying to not make him mad. And as I often refer to this in the community, like, she has become a narcissist ninja, which is where she is able to see the pattern. She's able to see through the hooks and the little behaviors and the manipulations without getting sucked back in. And she started to really accept, like, to see him for who he is, to know that she will never win in this game, right? Understanding that he will not see her, that the story he has about her, which has now turned into, like I was saying earlier, like a story that she's the manipulator and she's the villain. He gets to have that story, sticking with the facts, letting him spin in his alternate realities and stories about her, and stepping into what she actually has control over. I just sent her over the parallel parenting course that Pare gave us in our workshop. I was like, that's what you're going to be doing. And really valuing herself more. That's what I saw most of all. And it was very inspiring. I was just like, this is the kind of work that changes lives. So, for those women, for my 20% of the women listening to this podcast who have partners that are probably like clinically diagnosable NPD, I will always, yes, I loved Isabel Morley's approach around let's not use this speak so much, but for those women, I will always be speaking plainly and openly about narcissistic abuse and its effects. And for the 80% of my listeners that are the rest, my loves, that is where this continuum that I'm just like so jazzed about this month, that is where the continuum comes in and where it is the most helpful, because it's going to help you see yourself as well on this continuum and develop the awareness to change that for yourself. And, there are many women who are doing the work to heal their codependency. Like, I see this in so many of you. You do have awareness. You are seeing your trauma. You are seeing that childhood patterns. You are investing and reading the books and doing the things to try to become an emotional adult, to acknowledge and be responsible for the protective responses or coping mechanisms that you learned from your childhood trauma. And for those women specifically, right, those of you that are doing that and then getting tangled up in trying to label and identify your partner as narcissistic or not, this is a beautiful way to just see those behaviors, recognize the root, see your own part in it, right? As I've 6 years out been able to realize, like, ooh, I had a lot of codependency from my trauma with my mother that I brought to the marriage. And from a more neutral, I think of it just kind of like when the math isn't mathing kind of approach to the relationship, be able to center in yourself and admit realistically, like, this is who I'm across from. How much can they want to, or even actually, like, even if they want to, even actually do the work to be able to meet you where you're at. And even along with that, even if they do want to do the work and they could do the work, you still getting to decide for yourself, is that how you want to spend the next years of your life? Like, I think that's ultimately also where I landed in my marriage, is I could see my ex-husband wanted to do the work. He probably could do the work over the next like 5 to 10 years. And I did not want to spend the next 5 to 10 years of my life doing this work with him. God, it is just so like, it's so freeing for me to admit that and to acknowledge that, to, take full responsibility on my end that that was not the path I wanted to walk for the next 5 to 10 years. Here I am 6 years post-divorce, y'all, and I could have been spending 6 years in my marriage working through that with him. And I know for some of you that will be the path. And so, like, love that path. Like, if that's your path, go all in and choose that. But that was not my path. I could feel it. My soul calls. There was no light there for me. And damn, am I so grateful that I did not. Because instead, I've had 6 years now focusing on me and what I needed to thrive and heal. And this goes back to what I was just saying about, like, when the math isn't mathing. One of the other things I loved that Pare emphasized in the workshop when women were asking, like, how do you heal from narcissistic abuse or things that happened in your childhood? And she said, there's just some things that you can't heal unless you're in a healthy, securely attached relationship. And that, y'all, I have found to be true. Before meeting Joe, I would not have been able to say that. I would not have been able to verify that. I would have been like, you just have to take Praise word on that. But no, same thing that Pete Walker says in the CPTSD book. He emphasizes the incredible importance and gift that it is when you can find someone that is a fit, that has secure attachment, and that wants to be in a partnership with you where you get to heal together. That has been the case for me and Joe over these last 2 years. I would also offer. Like, that's where I've landed now, right? I met him 4 years post-divorce. Even before that, though, I left my marriage. I decided to get divorced. I realize now because I needed space and freedom to do my own individuation, to figure out who I was, to grow, to learn about myself in a space that was uninhibited by judgment and the opinions of my spouse. So prior to that, y'all, I'd never had that experience. I'd grown up with a mother that had a ton of opinions, super controlling, and I went straight from her into a marriage with my spouse. And so in a way, I gave myself that container. Okay. I gave myself the space when I got divorced to have an environment that was just me. Half the time when I didn't have my kids, I got to be in a space where I got to play, I got to explore, I got to learn about myself with nobody looking over me, with no mother looking over with me, no spouse having opinions and ideas about what I was doing. And that allowed me to finally start learning who I really was outside of a marriage or a family dynamic. And that was hugely, hugely transformative and healing. So I want to also emphasize, like, I love that I had that journey even before I met Joe. I definitely want to not, at all ever encourage or impress upon all of you that, like, you need to get divorced and then go find like home run, first try, secure attachment partner. Like, that may happen for some of you. That may not for a lot of you. And I definitely don't ever want that to be the standard, because I got to see how valuable it was to do that process with myself as well. I think it really has to come back to like your journey being your own. And no matter what your journey looks like, partnered or unpartnered, still giving to yourself the most important gift you can give, which I believe is choosing to create a life and an environment that supports your continued softening into finally just being who you genuinely are, and an environment that allows you and encourages you to just be yourself, and reminds you that you are worthy of love for no other reason than that you exist and are you. That is the work I started when I was leaving divorce, and over those 4 years in dating, and when I would have partners that wanted me to change, wanted me to be different, choosing myself over them. And that is ultimately, culminated in the relationship that Joe and I have now. And actually, I mentioned to Joe yesterday how much, we were talking a little bit about my family, and I was discussing that, like, when you grow up in a family that performs love and demands that you perform that love as well, you never really know what it feels like to not be on a stage. So I only know that now because in the last few years, in my relationship with Joe, I have started to learn what it feels like in my personal relationships to not actually be like masking my feelings or performing. It was just like, that's the family I grew up in. In the family I grew up in, you performed. You had to mask and hide your feelings from my mother, because if your feelings didn't match hers, it was not safe. And so I didn't really have an identity. I wasn't really, I would say, like, truly me, because it wasn't safe to be me. And so I was just always an actor, kind of chameleoning to be whatever anybody needed me to be. And wow, is it an incredibly healing and transformative experience to finally be able to get off the stage and just start living life as myself. I feel like I am able to do that way more, in my public life. I think that's what you guys feel on the podcast. Like, this is me. You guys get to see me. When I went to the retreat this year, I loved hearing from some of the women. I think the feeling that came through was who I am on the podcast is who they met. It wasn't like two different people. And I attribute that to those years post-divorce where I really was only accountable to me, half the time. It was, I get to be me. I get to do me. I get to love me. I get to show up as me. And now in these last 2 years with Joe, I would say it's been taking that to an even deeper level of in my personal relationships, with a partner. Of course, one of the biggest areas I think I learned to perform was with romantic partners. And that was often because romantic partners did not have secure attachment enough to be with me. Like, y'all, I am a beautiful fucking a lot with my ADHD and my bossiness and my emotionalness and my sea lionness. Like, I look back and I'm like, man, bless the little hearts of all those guys who dated me that were like, whoa, this is, in their words, this is a lot. I think a lot of them felt like I was a lot. And so I couldn't even be my full self until meeting a partner that is securely attached enough that I've never felt like I am too much or not enough with Joe. And that is an incredible gift. And that is the piece, y'all. That is the piece to remember when we are thinking, back over all of this episode, right? Are they a narcissist? Are they not? It doesn't matter so much as coming back to the piece for you of what do you need to come to know yourself, to heal in the ways that you most desire in your one beautiful life. That's really where I hope you land with me in this episode, is taking in the much, much bigger picture of, just what I think patriarchy in some ways has given us, which is we prioritize so much a marriage and a centering of our partner, and really at the expense for some of us, especially if there are narcissistic traits and behaviors involved, at the expense of relationship, healing, connection with ourselves, and living a life where we truly get to feel like we take off the mask. We're no longer on the stage, and we have a place where we get to truly be ourselves. Y'all, that is what I have got for you on today's episode. I want to finish this one by saying that, if you are one of my babes listening that is still wanting that confirmation, right? And I want to be so compassionate about this piece because I do think that's just part of the process. And so just know there is no shame here, right? I'm providing this bigger perspective on this. I'm cautioning us against labeling everybody as narcissists, but also it can be so helpful to just have another pair of eyes on the situation. And y'all, that is what my Get Unstuck and Empowered sessions, I call them the 90-minute sessions. Those are what they are for. And these alone, I have heard back from so many women about how just this one session with me is what it took to shift their perspective and just get things moving. So please know, if you are, like I said, I hope I really conveyed that in this episode, that where I was at way back, 7 years ago when I was considering divorce, I just needed someone to say, this is real. You're not crazy. These are definable narcissistic traits and behaviors, and they feel shitty for a reason. And right, that's what Parade did for me. And it was life-changing. Now, if you are one of my listeners that perhaps has got your financial piece like locked in, you're not worried about that, but you cannot seem to wade through all of the mental confusion, the painful feelings, and the emotional turmoil in your process with considering divorce, y'all, I'm speaking directly to you. This is you, my loves. This is the perfect month to give yourself the gift of a lifetime by coming and working with me one-on-one. This is something more and more I'm just really recognizing and owning in myself, that I go all in so deeply on my one-on-one clients. And I'm seeing it right now. I had some new one-on-one clients come in the last 2 to 3 months, and I'm just seeing how much being loved and seen by me, along with the tools I teach and the really in-depth connection and support you receive through the Voxer access, is life-changing. Like, it not only helps my clients in the decision process, right? Figuring out what they want to do in the considering piece, but I'm seeing so much how it is on a much deeper level. Like I was saying earlier, that like secure attachment to self level that we do the work. And I actually had like one of my one-on-one clients this week. She, was starting to see these patterns that we've been identifying in her marriage. It was so cute. At some point she was leaving me a box and she was like, "Oh my God, I think I'm realizing that like my mother has the same things." And I was like, "Yes, yes. This is the work that like ripples out into all these other areas of your life. It's the work I've done on my life. And I love having clients that not only do we get to do the work around their marriage, but we get to do these like much deeper soul reclamation kind of work that's really, really at the heart of my deep dive container. And that just comes from working with me because I love to go deep. And heading into this next year, 2026, I'm feeling so excited lately to really, on my end, open and expand into, taking on more one-on-one clients, to really start this new year off strong, to really help more women shift out of the like, it's been years and years that I've been considering. And I just like, no, we're ready. Let's go. Let's give you the pieces and the tools you need to make this next year really, really different than all the ones that you've had in the past. I want the women that I work with to truly discover more of themselves while we work together, and to leave that container with a foundation of tools that they will use for the rest of their life in all areas of their life. If you are in a different group though, where you're like, financially one-on-one, I would love to do it, but I can't. Y'all, that is what I created the community for. The community is, a place where we are still doing so much. I am still teaching so much of the tools and the work. We're not getting to do it, with me one-on-one and boxering you all the time, but I still see women getting massive results there. I still see them getting the results of making their decisions, shifting forward, especially the women that get on and they show up to our live calls. They create one-on-one relationships with other women in the community, which we highly encourage there. They are experiencing those shifts in their own big, massive ways. And it's something I'm deeply proud of and hoping to grow and expand on this next year as well. Finally, last piece, y'all, just a little bit of housekeeping here. And this one I'm like very excited about. I thought I'd figured this out when I first launched Substack, but I didn't. And I'm excited to announce it now. So for my paid Substack subscribers, I wanted to let you know that I have opened up a feature on Substack, okay, where you can now gift free month-long subscriptions to friends of your choice. That was one of the things I'd recently heard back. Just, some of you being like, it's such a bummer. I'll listen to an episode and I want so badly to share it with someone, but I can't. This is how we're going to do it now. So, also, for me personally, I haven't talked much about politics lately on the pod, but you guys know where I'm landing on all of that lately, where I've been landing through this entire year. And aligned with that, one of the things I'm really trying to cut back on this holiday season is spending, really supporting the economic boycott. That's something Joe and I did last week during Thanksgiving. We really tried to, ahead of time, have everything and then not spending during the week. And I was surprised how much I actually loved it. It was not as hard. We didn't go out to eat. We didn't go buying nothing from Amazon. I'm really trying to get off Amazon, y'all. Oh, that one. I'm really trying. I live out in the country and it is like, so I'm working on that one, but I want to put this forward. Like, I think this is a great personal alternative to like share a resource that can help someone you love. Like, this is a great way. If you're not going to be spending money on gifts, this is something that you can share that helps them in so many ways, getting access to the podcast for a month. So you will get an email from me tomorrow that will give you your 3 gift subscriptions, and that will allow you to send out to 3 people that you love 1 free month of listening to the full episodes that are now on Substack. As always, my first, I think the first 78 are free on Apple. But I know there's been a lot of good ones that have come through, especially that episode last week with Olivia. Like, oh, that is the kind of episode that I want to be shared for sure. Also, along with that, a little side piece to this is understanding that I also have a referral program, y'all, through Substack, where when you share an episode or you send the podcast to a friend, so even with these 1-month subscriptions, I think it will work as well. If they subscribe as either a paid or a free, so both, you will end up getting a little like it'll count. There's going to be a leaderboard and it'll count as one of your referrals. And then we'll have rewards going there as well, where you can get a 1-month comp. So if you're on a monthly payment schedule with Substack, if you end up getting 5 referrals sent in, 1 month gets paid for free. And it goes up from there. If you get 10 referrals, you can get a 3-month comp, 25 referrals, 6-month comp. So this is like an amazing way to be able to share it with people that you love, spread the word far and wide, and also get some of your monthly Substack subscription fees paid for. I really would love, y'all. 2026 is the year that I am wanting to expand my reach, to reach even more women with these life-changing episodes and discussions on the podcast, to really open the community more, to hopefully like really see that grow as I see more and more of us needing this support, needing this love, needing to feel connected to women that get it. So I would love to have you be a part of helping me in that big opening and branching out this next year. Keep your eye out in your inbox for how to do that. And I will look forward to seeing you all on next week's episode. Till then.